We're talking about all things Canada today on the Travel Lemming podcast.
Here's a 30-second teaser of this episode.
More than 60% of Canadians live south of Seattle, which is actually pretty mind boggling to think about. If you are on a budget, some places can be a lot harder to visit, such as Vancouver. It is a very expensive city. So, the thing about Banff, however, is that because it's so popular, it's one of Canada's most popular destinations, it gets absolutely packed with people. If you love dinosaurs, you have to go to the Badlands in Alberta. Drumheller is probably the most popular and well known of the places to go for dinosaurs.
If you haven't visited our friendly neighbors to the north, this episode will surely inspire you to get packing. And this episode is sponsored by Tortuga backpacks, which we will tell you a little bit more about later. So, if you're an American, Canada is one of the easiest international destinations to visit. It borders 13 of our United States. So, if you live in the northern part of the US, there's probably a major Canadian city within a 2-hour flight from your home. It's a beautiful country. The people are sweet as can be. But I'm going to let our Canada expert be the one to really convince you why you should go to Canada. So, without further ado, welcome to the show, our born and raised Canadian, Taylor Herperger.
Hi, Betty. So happy to be here. Yeah, so I am a born and raised Canadian. I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba at the moment. Yeah, and I've been with Travel Lemming, gosh, for almost 6 years. I'm the director of marketing and I'm also the podcast producer. So I'm the lucky person who gets to edit this afterward.
Yes, for our regular listeners, you would never know it, but Taylor is a part of every single episode. She and our editing team put in hours of work for the podcast and make it the seamless show that it is today. So I want to tell you, Taylor, from the bottom of my heart, and Nate and all of our listeners, I'm sure, how grateful I am for all the work you do to make the Travel Lemming podcast exist.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So now let's get into Canada. So Taylor, I know you're a Canadian, but what makes you an expert on Canada?
Yeah. So, like you said, I am a born and raised Canadian. I was born in Saskatchewan, which is a prairie province just a little bit west of center. So, I grew up there. After high school, I moved to Ontario and I lived in Toronto for about 7 years. So, I got to know Ontario very well. After that, I long-term traveled in there quite a bit too, so I'm skipping ahead on the timeline. But I moved out to Alberta, and I spent a year living in Alberta, and after that, I moved to Winnipeg. So I've now lived in 4 provinces. I've also traveled coast to coast in Canada. So I have technically been to all 10 lower provinces. So in Canada, there are 10 provinces and 3 territories. I haven't had any meaningful experiences in New Brunswick yet, so I can't totally say that I've been to New Brunswick. I have driven through it, but I don't think a gas station counts. So, but I have had meaningful experiences and I've traveled coast to coast from the southern 10 provinces. So I know Canada very well. I've spent most of my life here when I'm not traveling.
Amazing. Well, I think you've proven yourself as an expert here. So, speaking of like the provinces and whatnot, can you start by kind of painting a picture for listeners how Canada is laid out?
Absolutely. So Canada is actually the second largest country in the world. And I am going to pull up a number here. It has a landmass of 9.985 million kilometers squared, which is just a little bit larger than the USA. It has the longest coastline of anywhere in the world. Canada's coastline borders the Pacific Ocean in the west, the Arctic in the north, and the Atlantic in the east. Like I said, it has 10 provinces and 3 territories. And each of these places has its own distinct culture. So I would say that there are a lot of Canadianisms that really bind Canada together as a country, but each of the regions is very distinct. So they always say it's like it's a mosaic, not a melting pot. And so the center and the north, people do live in these regions, but they are vastly underpopulated. So most of the Canadians I'm going to put a stat here. So, according to bigthink.com, actually, 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border. More than 70% of Canadians live below the 49th parallel. And actually, more than 60% of Canadians live south of Seattle, which is actually pretty mind boggling to think about, but very cool. If you pull up a map, the GTA in Toronto is the most densely populated part of Canada. And that's where and that is actually below the 49th parallel. So,
That Seattle stat is so wild to me. I need to look at a map, but it just doesn't make any sense to me. But
I
so,
know.
so what are the best cities in Canada, in your opinion?
That's a big
Of
question.
course.
A lot of
I know
thoughts
it's
on that.
huge, but if you can break it down.
So I'm gonna start with this is very controversial, but I have to mention Toronto because it is Canada's largest metropolis. It's incredibly diverse. It's a financial hub and it has a ton of culture. So a lot of Canadians would probably bristle at me mentioning Toronto first because it is with the rest of Canada, it's not always indicative of the culture of the rest of Canada, but I do have to mention it because it's an incredible city. I mean, like I said, I lived there for 7 years. It's very near and dear to my heart. Yeah, and there's just endless amounts of things to do there. I also want to mention Montreal. So this is located in Quebec. They do speak French there as a first language, but you will be able to get by with English when you're in Montreal proper, sorry. If you venture out of Montreal, many people only speak French, but Montreal is such a cultural hub. There's always like art museums, and it's one of the best places for gastronomy in Canada. There's festivals. Osheaga is one of the best festivals that I've personally been to in Montreal. And they do winter very well there too. There's a ton of winter festivals, so that's very cool.
Sorry, I
That's
just
very
wanted to ask you what Osheaga is.
Yeah, of course. Osheaga is actually a music and arts festival in Montreal that happens every summer in Parc Jean Drapeau, and it brings in a ton of people. It's so much fun. They get a lot of really big and popular performers, so definitely recommend that if you're going to Montreal.
Oh, very cool. So what are your other favorite cities?
I also have to mention Vancouver. That's also one that people know of when they think of Canada. Vancouver is located in British Columbia, and it's not on the coast. So you have Vancouver, which is on the ocean, and then there is Vancouver Island, which is right beside it. But Vancouver is right on that coast. I would characterize Vancouver as it's very hippy dippy, especially as you get a little bit more into the specific neighborhoods. It's known as being very eclectic and easygoing and laid back, even though it is a really big city. It's very cool. Then I'm also going to mention Calgary. Most people go to Calgary when they want to go to Banff. So it's the closest airport and major hub to Banff, and it's about an hour away. So, but they also have the Calgary Stampede. So that's another really big reason to go there. There's a lot of great restaurants, galleries, art, that kind of stuff too, but it's more Western. So when you think of Calgary, I like to kind of liken it to the Texas of Canada, where you have a lot of cowboy culture, for lack of a better word. I also wanna mention Charlottetown. So Charlottetown and Prince Edward Island as a whole is one of my favorite places in all of Canada. It's a very small city, but it has a ton of charm, ton of coastal charm. The people there are just fantastic, so nice. I've been greeted with some of Canadians in general are very polite, but I would say the most polite in Charlottetown and Prince Edward Island. I personally live in Winnipeg, so I have to give a shout out to Winnipeg. It gets a bad rap for being one of the coldest places, in the world, but which is definitely true in the wintertime, but we have an incredible restaurant scene, actually. A lot of restaurants that are end up going elsewhere in Canada are usually tested on the people of Winnipeg because we do go out so much. And yeah, it's a prairie city, so you have a laid back attitude, but then it's also a city of almost 1 million people, so it's a little bit more urban as well.
And for listeners, I know that Taylor just mentioned so many awesome cities. If you want to learn more about them, Taylor has guides to all of these, like the best cities in Canada, which you can check out at travellemming.com. We'll give you some more information on that at the end of the show, but all of these will be linked in the show notes. So if you want to do more of a deep dive into these places, definitely check out Taylor's articles on the website. And now a quick message from our sponsors over at Tortuga Backpacks. Today's episode is sponsored by Tortuga Backpacks. I took my 40-liter travel backpack light on a 6-day trip to Japan during the winter. So I was able to fit 6 days worth of clothing in there, including my bulkier winter wear like my thermals, a winter jacket, along with my laptop, a book, and an extra camera lens. With the hip and chest belts clipped, it didn't cut into my back and shoulders like I've experienced with other backpacks. Oh, and all of their bags are carry-on friendly, so they'll fit in the overhead bins of any airline. As a flight attendant, I was pleasantly surprised by the convenience of this backpack, especially because I'm someone who is so used to traveling with the suitcase. If you want to take along all the essentials for your travels and never have to worry about checking a bag or paying extra fees, check out Tortuga Backpacks. Click the link in the show notes to get 10% off your first order, or visit travellemming.com/Tortuga to pick your perfect pack today. So I know it's a hard question because Canada is so massive, but how would you recommend someone starts planning their trip to Canada?
So I would recommend picking a large city, renting a car, and going from there. So whether you want to go to Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, or Charlottetown in Prince Edward Island, Vancouver, renting a car and then going from there. So I would recommend picking a city based on the types of things you like to do and the vibe you want, and then exploring around that place.
Where should budget travelers stay in Canada?
Yeah. So as of recording this in March 2025, Canada's dollar is actually about 30% less than the USA's and about 35% less than the euro. So right now, if you're from either of those places, is a great time to visit Canada because you are essentially getting it on sale. That said, if you're on a budget, you can find great budget hotels in most places, especially if you visit during the spring, fall, or winter. So I would characterize high season, of course, in Canada being the summer. Everyone generally wants to come here when it's warm. So if you do visit in one of the shoulder or off seasons, you will get a discount as well. However, if you are on a budget, some places can be a lot harder to visit, such as Vancouver. It is a very expensive city. For example, a couple years ago, I went there in the summertime, and even a budget Holiday Inn hotel near the airport was like almost $500 a night. So it's harder to visit those places if you're not visiting in the off season. So pick the time of year wisely. However, I am impartial to the prairies as a great budget friendly destination, born and raised, like I said, in Saskatchewan and living in Manitoba now. Although some people might disagree with me, Prince Edward Island, the Maritimes in general, are also better for budget. But generally, if you are on a major budget, stay away from the large metropolises. Something else I will say on budget is when you think of budget or you're a budget backpacker, you think about staying in hostels, and Canada just doesn't have that many hostels. You'll find them definitely in like Toronto. I think I've heard of them in Montreal, Ottawa, Vancouver. But where I live in Winnipeg, it's a city of almost 1 million people, and there are no hostels to be found. So you really have to think about that when you're trying to find accommodations.
And you mentioned the prairies. I know it's kind of self-explanatory, but can you tell us a little bit about what exactly the prairies are?
Yeah, for sure. So you have the West, and then you have British Columbia, you have the Rocky Mountains, and the Rockies end in Alberta. So beyond the Rockies and Alberta is when the prairies start. So the three prairie provinces in Canada are generally characterized as Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So there's a lot of agriculture in these provinces, a lot of rolling prairie land, generally flat, so to speak. And actually, Saskatchewan, one of the funny things people say is that you can watch your dog running away for days on end because of how flat it is in Saskatchewan, but big agriculture places. So those are the three prairie provinces.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like the Midwest in the US.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, makes
Yep. And
sense.
those are the provinces like for American listeners, viewers, those are the provinces like above North Dakota, Minnesota, Montana, that kind of thing. Well,
Makes
not
sense.
not the mountains in Montana, but yes.
And when you're talking about just like how it's kind of like a 30% discount compared to Americans, like I'm a flight attendant and so many times I get sent to Vancouver or Calgary or Toronto and it's so nice because I feel like I'm like a king there because I can go out and
Yeah,
I don't have to pay an arm and a leg to go get dinner there. So, yeah, if you're an American listener,
totally.
it's nice. Even if you're looking for budget options in Canada, like you're going to get a very affordable trip compared to the prices that you're gonna be getting in most large American cities.
Totally. I completely agree.
Where should outdoorsy people stay in Canada?
Yeah. So, like I said, I mean, Canada is a country of just over 40 million people, and it's the second biggest country in the world. So, a lot of places are just vast wilderness. So, it's really easy for outdoorsy people to come here. However, if you do want a little bit of civilization, I would recommend a few places in particular. So, the first place I would recommend outdoorsy travelers is, of course, the Rocky Mountains. So, these are located in British Columbia and Alberta in Western Canada. And of course, almost everyone has heard of Banff. There are other national parks out there as well. So you have like Jasper, you have Kootenay National Park, you have my personal favorite, Yoho, which I actually nominated Yoho National Park for one of the best places to travel in 2025 on our annual list. Other great places, though, for outdoorsy travelers, I would recommend the Maritimes. Some of the best hikes I've done in the world are actually in the Maritimes. So, for example, Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island, there's some incredibly gorgeous hikes there. Again, going west, I would have to recommend Vancouver Island for outdoorsy travelers. This is a very similar place to like Seattle. It's very close, of course. So, of course, it has much of the same topography and outdoorsy, like the giant trees, the ocean, whale watching, that kind of thing on Vancouver Island. And then more of a hidden gem, actually, for outdoorsy people, I would recommend Eastern Manitoba as well. So you have the Canadian Shield, but there's lots of vast wilderness. So one of my favorite provincial parks that I love going to is called Nopaming Provincial Park. and it is absolutely gorgeous. There's just trees for miles, lakes, and yeah, if you want a place that's a little bit more off the beaten path, I would recommend that.
Amazing. And you mentioned Yoho National Park, which, if you haven't checked out our list of the best places to travel in 2025, Yoho National Park lands the number 4 spot on that list. We actually have an entire podcast that we released New Year's Eve on that. So make sure to check that out after this episode. Speaking of national parks, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the best national parks in Canada? I know there's so many gorgeous destinations throughout the country.
Absolutely. So Canada has a lot of national parks. Of course, a lot of them are a little bit more north and hard to get to. So I'll just kind of ramble off some of the most accessible and best ones, in my opinion. So one of the most famous ones, and it's also the first national park in Canada, of course, is Banff. This is a bucket list destination for many travelers. Banff is, like I said earlier, about an hour's drive from Calgary, and you have turquoise lakes, you have incredible hikes, you have towering Rocky Mountains. It's absolutely stunning. Two of the best accommodations, I would say, in Canada are located in Banff National Park, which are the Fairmont Banff Springs. So that's the castle, and then also Chateau Lake Louise. Both of them, you can't go wrong. They're absolutely gorgeous. So, the thing about Banff, however, is that because it's so popular, it's one of Canada's most popular destinations, it gets absolutely packed with people. So, even the last time I went, which was about this time last year in March, like there was overflow parking just for Chateau Lake Louise. And that's mostly it's people who are actually staying there, but everyone going to Lake Louise and wanting to eat at the restaurant. Like it's just absolutely packed. So if you get a little bit over the people and want something more off the beaten path, Yoho National Park is located about an hour and a half from Banff, and it's just as stunning, but you get like a fraction of the crowds as well. Yoho does struggle too with a little bit of overcrowding, especially if you go in the summer. I love hiking in these national parks, by the way, in the shoulder seasons. I think that even if you go in May, June, September, October, I've been to both of these places in March and they're not that cold. These national parks really get shielded from a lot of the like brutal winter cold by the mountains. So it's a little bit more temperate. Also in that area, there's Kootenay National Park, Jasper National Park. Jasper National Park is one of my favorite places as well. So that is the Rocky Mountains National Parks that I would recommend. If you go totally in the other direction to Eastern Canada, Prince Edward Island National Park is stunning. There's sand dunes, you have the ocean right there, you have red cliffs, incredible hikes. Definitely recommend that one. And it's an easy day trip as well from Charlottetown if you go out that way. I have to keep on plugging Manitoba. So, Riding Mountain National Park is about 3 hours from Winnipeg. And it's one of the best places, I would say, in the prairies. It's kind of like its own little ecosystem outside of vast prairie land. So, one of my favorite places, there's actually a Nordic spa there, which you have to go to. Tons of accommodation. If you like boating and being out on the water, definitely recommend that too. And then another one that's probably a little bit more underrated and that people don't know about is Grasslands National Park. So this one is in my home province of, well, what we used to be my home province of Saskatchewan. And if you are looking for incredible stargazing, that's probably one of the best things to do in Grasslands National Park. There's also hoodoos and really great camping. So those are the national parks that I would recommend off the top of my head here.
Where are some other notable places to visit in Canada?
Yeah, so if you want more of a unique trip, I would have to recommend heading north to Yukon Territory, Northwest Territories, or Nunavut. I have to preface this by saying that I've never been to any of these territories, but they are a little bit more like it's northern Canada, right? So very unique terrain there. Actually, one of the places very high on my list of places to go is Dawson City in the Yukon Territory. It was the base during the 19th century Klondike Gold Rush, and the town has a bunch of really preserved frontier style buildings. So, yeah.
That sounds amazing. Thank you so much for that. So, are there any places you recommend avoiding in Canada?
So, I wouldn't say that there's any area or city or anything like that that is overwhelmingly bad and that you shouldn't go. However, I would recommend researching the neighborhoods in each place you go, especially in the prairies. Overall, the prairie cities do tend to be hit with a little bit more crime. This is usually crime that's very concentrated as well to certain areas. So, just in your research, I wouldn't like put anywhere off of your list, but definitely look up just the neighborhoods to avoid in any place.
Sure, and we'll definitely touch more on safety in a little bit. I know we just talked a little bit about this, but I want to ask you, when is the best time of year to visit Canada?
So the best time to visit Canada, summer is the obvious answer, but Crowds in popular places can be very intense and it absolutely gets more expensive. Plus, lately, actually, summer has been bringing a lot of wildfires. So, depending on if there's wildfires that year, lately in the past 5 years, there's been a lot of them, and the air gets very smoky. So, that's usually like late July, early August, and it can get actually incredibly hot in the summer. I know that when people think of Canada, it's usually, it's north, it's cold, but it gets very hot. Here in Winnipeg, where I live, for example, it goes like down to minus 30 degrees Celsius in the winter. It can get up to plus 35 degrees Celsius in the summertime. Of course, in the prairies, it's very much of like a dry heat. But a place like Toronto gets hit with a lot of humidity in the summer too. So definitely have a place with air conditioning. Canada gets hotter than you think it does. I so would also recommend, however, of course, yeah, summer, like I said, it gets very expensive. So because that's when all of the tourists go, that's when even Canadians travel. So will skyrocket. If you're looking for somewhere a little bit more budget friendly, I would recommend seeing the leaves change color in like Ontario and Quebec. This is late September and early October. If you're interested in skiing and snowboarding, visit during the winter. There's more places to ski and snowboard too outside of the Rocky Mountains. So I would recommend specifically late February, March, and even April. Snow can last into the mountains into late spring actually because of the elevation. So and in the winter, coastal places tend to be a little bit more temperate. So for example, Vancouver has a climate and Vancouver Island very similar to Seattle. So you're not necessarily going to get heaps of snow, but it's going to be a little bit more temperate, a little bit more of a rainy season. So very much it depends where you go in Canada for when is the best time to visit.
Absolutely. Yeah. So many different climates, different seasons. You got to figure out your goals and then you can figure out when to go. Okay. So, what's the best way to navigate Canada?
Yeah. So if you're visiting a big city, you can 100% get around by using public transit. Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, they have great public transit systems. Ubers and cabs are widely available also in all of the cities. Another interesting option too is Via Rail. So this is a cross-country train option. It goes actually coast to coast in Canada and it stops. I'm just pulling it up here on the Via Rail website. So it links more than 410 stations in 8 provinces. And I know a lot of people love to do the sleeper train and just go coast to coast. I've met people who have done this multiple times. It's a really cool thing to do. And there's actually more train routes as well in Eastern Canada, such as between Toronto and Montreal. So you can take the train between those big cities. Buses aren't as widely used, especially between cities that are outside of that, like Greater Toronto area. They actually got rid of Greyhound a few years ago. So if you are visiting the prairie provinces or Alberta or British Columbia, even, you can't necessarily rely on buses to get around. A lot of these cities, if you're going from city to city, you have to either fly, which can cost quite a bit of money, or you have to drive. I would recommend for most of these places that it's easiest if you're visiting multiple places in Canada, you generally need a car. However, you can just stay in a big city and do guided tour day trips from that city as well. So, for example, if you're staying in Toronto, you can do a guided day tour to a Niagara Falls, or you can actually even take public transit to that place as well. And like I mentioned, flights are a good option. So, depending on where you're going, they can be relatively cheap. If you're going from coast to coast in Canada, of course, this is going to be a very expensive option. Flight prices also very much depend on the type of year you visit Canada. So, they can go as low as $150 Canadian round trip, but that's generally the lowest. So we don't quite have the same budget options as they do in the USA.
Gotcha. And regarding renting a car, is it pretty easy to drive in Canada?
Yes, so driving in Canada is very similar to the USA. Of course, each province has a little bit different rules depending on where you are. For example, some places will have like a flashing red light if you need to stop instead of a stop sign, which even gets me as a Canadian who doesn't have that in Manitoba. So you just need to look up some of those regional differences for driving, but if you're coming from Europe or the USA, it's very similar. So
So, you've already discussed a few awesome things to do in Canada based on region, city. What are some other major things to do in the country that you haven't discussed yet?
yeah, so like I mentioned, the Via Rail cross country sleeper train trip. I think this is one of the best things to do in Canada and a great way to see the whole country if that's on your list. I also have to recommend seeing the polar bears in Manitoba. So Churchill is actually the polar bear capital of the world, and you can take a train from Winnipeg or fly there as well. In the summer, Churchill actually is also great for whale watching. And so Wetbusk Adventures is actually an Indigenous owned and operated tour company located in Churchill, Manitoba. So if you're going to go there, I recommend looking them up. I also recommended some festivals earlier as well. So I talked about Osheaga. I talked about Calgary Stampede. Another huge one, of course, is the Toronto International Film Festival. So I used to go here every year when I lived in Toronto. I absolutely loved going to the premieres of all of the film. And it's a whole event. But if you're going to go to TIFF, book your accommodations in advance because things get crazy expensive and they book up very quickly. Also, there's a ton of festivals in the winter as well, such as Festival de Voyageur here in Winnipeg. So look up winter festivals if you're coming then. I also want to touch on Indigenous experiences. This is something that you definitely want to prioritize on your trip to Canada. So Canada formed in 1867 under the British Empire, but actually Indigenous peoples arrived here at least 14,000 years ago. So there's so much history here when it comes to Indigenous people that I think that you should definitely just when you're looking up, say you're going to Alberta, like Indigenous tour providers in Calgary, and you're going to get some really cool things to do. So, speaking of Alberta, one of my favorite places to go for this is called Writing on Stone Provincial Park near Milk River. It's right near the Montana border, kind of in the Alberta Badlands. And it's both a nature preserve and protection for many First Nations. So, the park actually features thousands of rock paintings and carvings, a lot of which date to 1050 BCE. And this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's home to the largest collection of rock art on the North American plains, and it's a sacred place to the Blackfoot people. So here you're going to find hoodoos, like it's hoodoos for miles, just like rocks jutting out of the landscape, campsites, hiking trails. Also, rattlesnakes. So be careful. This is the Alberta Badlands, and we do have rattlesnakes in that area of Canada. They do not exist outside of it, but you have to pay attention to that when you're in Alberta for sure.
Sounds kinda like Arizona. I didn't know that you guys had landscapes like that.
Yeah, there's actually not too far from there too. There are sand dunes. Like we have full sand dunes with cacti growing out of them. So you have a little bit of everything in Canada for sure.
That's awesome.
Okay, and another awesome thing to do that I have to recommend is whale watching. So, of course, this only really applies to the coast, but it's one of the best things to do in Canada. And it's truly, I mean, you can do this around the world, but it's especially majestic. So, I actually went and saw blue whales, which apparently are very unique. They're not often seen off the coast of Newfoundland last August, and it was incredible. Also, another great thing to do in Newfoundland and St. John's is to get screeched in. So, this is when you take a shot of rum, kiss a frozen cod, and eat a piece of bologna. It's ridiculous and amazing, and everyone who goes to Newfoundland has to do that. And dinosaurs, if you love dinosaurs, you have to go to the Badlands in Alberta. Drumheller is probably the most popular and well known of the places to go for dinosaurs. The Royal Tyrrell Museum contains a large collection of dinosaur fossils. They also have the world's largest dinosaur, which is a giant Model T Rex, and you can actually climb to the top with views from the jaw. Kids love this. I did this when I was like 11 and loved it. And then to the southeast in Drumheller, there's the Atlas Coal Mine National Historic Site, which explains a little bit of coal mining heritage in the area. This place has great hikes. There's dinosaurs, there's like little treks that you can take. Not far from Drumheller is Dinosaur Provincial Park. So this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's about 220 kilometers east of Calgary. The park is one of the richest dinosaur fossil locations in the world. So there have been, I'm just reading here, 58 dinosaur species have been discovered at the park. It's one of my favorite places. The views are incredible. There's literally dinosaur fossils in the ground as you're walking. Again, in all these places, watch out for scorpions, watch out for rattlesnakes because I do have that. So, yeah, those are my top experiences.
Is there any Canadian etiquette that visitors should know before they go? And what about societal taboos?
Yeah, so I mean, I have to address the elephant in the room, and that is that Canadians are very polite, and it's not just a stereotype. We are very polite here. So, generally, like, say if you're out hiking, say hi when you pass in the prairies, and this even like takes people from urban Canada by surprise. In Saskatchewan, where I'm from, if you're driving down the highway, the person passing you in the car will wave at you, and it's customary to do that. So, more in the rural areas, give a little wave as you're going past someone on the highway.
I love it.
Also, the famous sorry, we say sorry to everything. Sorry doesn't actually mean sorry unless, like, it obviously does in a context. It usually means excuse me. They call it the Canadian standoff, but say if you're both going to a door to open at the same time, Some of them will often say sorry and like let you go ahead of them. So it's usually like you have little polite standoffs and it's a real thing here. Also, don't be late. There's people are in general are very punctual, so try to show up on time. And then also tipping. So tipping generally now in Canada, I think this is very similar in the States now too, is 15 to 20% standard for service workers at restaurants and coffee shops. So yeah, I would just recommend just be on your very best behavior and you'll get along fine with Canadians.
Yeah, very good to know. I must say, my favorite passengers in the whole world are Canadians. I love
Ah,
working flights to Canada. People are so nice to me. I swear, they're like the smoothest flights with the kindest people. No one has any issues. Everyone says sorry all the time and I love it.
that makes me very proud to hear, I have to say.
Yes, no, you guys really are just the nicest people. And very quickly, I know you touched on this earlier, but how would you characterize safety in Canada?
Yeah. So, I mean, overall, Canada is very safe, and even the most high crime places in Canada generally still have a lower crime rate than a lot of major US cities. So even when you see those higher crime rates, yeah, like nothing, I've lived here my entire life and it's been very safe. As a solo female walking around by myself a lot of the time, very safe place. And I actually live in one of the most dangerous places in Canada, and I still feel very safe walking around. It's mostly just knowing where to avoid. So, like I mentioned earlier, just do a quick neighborhood search on the city before you go there just to see what areas to avoid, what people generally say about that. So another big safety tip I would recommend is prepare for the weather. So of course it can get dangerously cold here in the wintertime, especially in northern Canada and in the prairies. So where I live in Winnipeg, it can get down to minus 30 degrees Celsius. I'll put up the Fahrenheit on the screen for those watching on YouTube because I don't know it off the top of my head. But if you go out for 5 to 10 minutes out in that weather, you could get frostbite. Like it gets very cold and it is quite dangerous. So also, if you visit in the wintertime, make sure you know how to drive on the snow and ice. I see this a lot of people not knowing how to handle a car. It's a little bit different if you're driving on ice. And if you're in the mountains as well, you will need winter tires and chains on your tires. And no matter where you are in Canada, if you're here and it's more than minus 20 degrees Celsius, you may need to plug in your car, or it simply won't start in the morning, or it'll leave you stranded. So you'll need a boost. So those are some tips there for safety. Also, I mean, there's a lot of more run-of-the-mill stuff, like, don't leave your car unlocked, don't leave stuff in the backseat of your car open to anyone maybe wanting to take it, don't wander around high crime areas, and then also be wildlife smart if you're out hiking or doing any outdoorsy things, because there is quite a bit of wildlife, and wildlife generally gets the right of way. We wanna coexist in a very peaceful way, so those would be my top safety tips for Canada.
Yes, very good tips, pretty standard proactive
Pretty sta
measures to avoid getting into a bad situation.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that about wraps up our episode on Canada. Is there anything else that you wanted to discuss, Taylor?
You know, Canada is just a very beautiful, incredibly diverse place. Second largest country in the world, like I said. So you should definitely visit multiple times over. It's not the same everywhere you go. Toronto is not Winnipeg. Winnipeg is not St. John's. There is an undercurrent of Canadianism throughout the whole country and what it means to be Canadian, but there are a ton of regional differences too. So come for yourself, see what you like, and yeah, we'd be more than happy to have you here.
Well, that wraps up our episode today. Listeners, make sure to check out Taylor's Canada guides at travellemming.com. She's also written guides for places to visit in Mexico, Croatia, and some other spots in Europe, as well as some awesome perspective pieces. So, of course, we'll link all relevant articles in the show notes for you to check out after the episode. Go to travellemming.com, type in Canada in the search bar, and get reading. We have over 1,500 guides for you to peruse. Also, if you like this episode, make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. We have new episodes coming out all the time. I want to let you know about our community meetups as well. So if you live anywhere near Phoenix, San Francisco, Seattle, Denver, Nashville, Chicago, San Juan, Puerto Rico, or Vancouver, come meet us in person. We talk about all things travel with like minded people over a pint. So we'd love to meet you. If there's anything that we didn't cover today on Canada, and if you have any questions, make sure to drop us a comment on this episode. We will respond as quickly as we can. We love to hear from our listeners, and we want to make sure that you get all the information that you'd like. I want to shout out our sponsors at Tortuga Backpacks one last time. Thank you guys so much for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. Thank you, Taylor, for being our Canadian expert. You are a wealth of information. And it's been so lovely getting to hear all about Canada from you today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on. This was wonderful.
And thank you to our listeners for being here and listening to this episode of the Travel Lemming podcast. We will see you on the next episode.